I don't think one needs to be much of a sports fan to appreciate the value of a timeout. A timeout is probably most valuable when the momentum of a game is going against your team and you need to stop that momentum in order to help your team regroup. It may be that your team needs to rethink its strategy and adjust to what the opponent is doing. Or it may be as simple as your team needs to catch its breath and be reminded that it needs to get back to the fundamentals of the game. Every coach knows the importance of calling a timeout at the right time. And the outcome of a game is often turned on the coach calling a timeout when it was most needed. Now, it's not only in sports that people often need a timeout in order to be at their best. Most workplaces recognize the importance of a timeout during the workday and actually build it into the schedule. A 10-minute break can help people to work with greater efficiency, and if you're working with the public, with greater effectiveness. We also know that a timeout for children can help them to think about their behavior and serves as a more effective way to discipline them. Many parents have learned that implementing a timeout with a child is much more challenging than spanking or yelling because it requires a certain emotional maturity on the part of the parent. It's my impression that this kind of maturity is required for other kinds of timeout. There's the danger that we can get carried away with the momentum or into thinking that if we just keep at it, we will succeed. I've often learned that when I'm under pressure, like writing a sermon on Saturday night and getting stuck, that the best thing I can do is take a break, do something else, and then come back to the task at hand. From coaching a team to disciplining a child to writing a sermon, a time out can make all the difference in all kinds of time. Our scripture reading from Psalm 46 today reminds us of the most important time out that all of us need to recognize and take. The psalmist begins by reminding us that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should shake. The psalmist goes on to remind us of how God has done things that we would not have thought possible. The psalmist declares that God makes war cease to the end of the earth. If you would have told me in college that apartheid in South Africa would be dismantled without great bloodshed, or if you had suggested that peace could be found in the Catholic-Protestant conflict in Ireland, I would have considered you a fool. But we know who the real fool is, don't we? The psalmist calls us into a larger perspective in the midst of however we may find ourselves at the moment, and instructs us to be still and to know that God is God. Herb Miller's written about how he was reminded of the importance of taking time out and making space for God. Miller was to be the guest speaker at a large university, and as a student was giving him a tour of one of the campus buildings, they walked down a hall, and he saw a sign over a doorway that read, "Prayer Room." As they moved past it, it became obvious that the student didn't intend to show him that room. Curious, Miller reached for the knob, and his nostrils were assaulted by a musty smell. The room was stuffed with boxes, clothes, and assorted junk. On the small altar stood a pair of cowboy boots, an old Gilby's vodka box, and a roll of toilet paper. A bit embarrassed, the student quickly explained, "We use this for storage in the summer, and we haven't gotten around to getting it cleaned out yet." Miller was appalled by the condition of that room, that prayer room. But he was even more appalled when he realized that the room was a parable for his life. There's a story about two British miners that can help us to better appreciate the wisdom of the psalmist and the need to take time out and make space for God. Because they've been digging coal in England for centuries now, the miners often travel many miles from the central shaft, and there's always the danger of miners getting lost. One particular day, two miners did indeed lose their way. As time passed, their lights finally went out. They wandered around in the darkness for a long time. In danger of losing their lives, one suggested that they sit down and be as still as possible in order to feel the way the air was moving, since the air always moves toward the central shaft. They sat there for a long time, when suddenly one of them felt a slight touch of air on his cheek. He sprang to his feet, and they went in the direction that the air was moving. They were able to reach the central shaft, and thereby gained their freedom from that dark captivity and close encounter with death. Our celebration of the sacrament of Holy Communion this morning invites us to be still and to know that God is God. In the gifts of bread and cup, we are called to remember that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. It's God's way of inviting us to take time out and to put everything else in our lives into a larger perspective. It can help us to sense the movement of God's Spirit, which we believe is always with us, and it invites us to trust in the direction that it's moving. Leslie Weatherhead, one of the great Christian philosophers of the last century, told about an old Scot who was quite ill and whose family had called for the minister. As he entered the man's room and sat down, he noticed another chair on the opposite side of the bed, which had been drawn close. The pastor commented, "Well, Donald, I see I'm not your first visitor today." The old man looked up, was puzzled for a moment, then recognized with a nod of the head the pastor had noticed the empty chair. "Well, Pastor," the old man replied, "I'll tell you about that chair. Many years ago, I found it quite difficult to pray. So one day, I shared this problem with my pastor. He told me not to worry about kneeling or placing myself in some pious posture. Instead, he said, just sit down, put a chair opposite you, and imagine Jesus sitting in it. Then talk with him as you would with a friend." The old man then added, "I've been doing that ever since." A short time later, the daughter of the old man called the pastor. When he answered, she informed him that her father had died very suddenly. She was quite shaken, for for she had no idea that death was that near. She related, I had just gone to lie down for an hour or two, where he seemed to be sleeping so comfortably. When I came back, he was dead. Then she added, everything was the same, except his hand was on that empty chair at the side of the bed. Isn't that strange? The minister replied, no, it's not strange at all. I understand. Let us understand the need for time out.